This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers, that is 2 3-page essays on the themes of Masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 568, entitled, "How can governments raise the birth rate to replacement level?" ? Description. This flyer addresses an increasingly pressing problem on the world scale, that is, the crashing birth rate, and what measures can be undertaken by governments to raise the birth rate to replacement level. One major way is to create a FIP Society, so that divorce is no longer toxic for men, by removing control of the divorce courts from the fluffie feminists, so that young men are prepared to be fathers again. Hefty payments, maternity wages and creche facilities, etc. need to be set up by governments to encourage women to mix their careerism with motherhood so that they can have both. Governments can also establish baby farms, paying professional mothers to have a baby nearly every year that is brought up by her and a professional staff that includes professional fathers, so that the children are raised by a group of adults of both sexes. These measures are suggested not to kick in immediately, but a bit later, so as to allow the current crash in the birth rate to reduce the world population to about 1/10 of its current figure to solve the global warming problem. Then they kick in. Governments will need to decide the date of that U-turn. Flyer itself. How can governments increase the birth rate to replacement level? ? By Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. One global disaster that most countries in the world have yet to really come to terms with is the crashing birth rate, that if unchecked will wipe us out. In Seoul, capital of South Korea, the birth rate is 0.63, which is under 1/3 of the replacement rate of 2.1 children per woman, which is needed if the population is not to fall. Do the math. If this birth rate is sustained, then Seoul will be depopulated in about a century, since in 4 generations, 1/3 of 1/3 of 1/3 of 1/3 is about 1%. The other 99% of the population have died off. European countries such as Spain, Italy, Germany have birth rates of 1.2, 1.3 and 1.5 respectively, all well under replacement rate. So if governments are unable to persuade people to have more kids, then we wipe ourselves out. So one way or another, governments have to step in and do something, since humanity is faced with its own extinction. So what can governments do? The first task is to become aware of what is causing the birth rates to be so low in many countries. Once one knows what is causing the problem, one has a clear idea of how to tackle the problem. So what is causing the birth rate to be so low? There are several major factors. Probably the biggest cause is that in major Western countries today, about 2/3 of young men refuse to marry and reject paternity due to the toxicity of the divorce courts that have been taken over by the fluffy feminists who see men as cash machines to be robbed and abused. In many countries, divorcing fathers have their kids ripped away from them with a probability of 90%. They lose their house to their ex-wife, so she can raise her kids in it. He loses half his wealth and half his stuff to her. He's forced to pay for his kids, whom he is barely allowed to see. If his ex-wife is a real fluffy, he may be forced to pay her alimony for the rest of his life, with no legal nor moral obligation on her to get off her fat parasitic ass and FIP up, so that she remains a parasite of him after the divorce the way she was before the divorce. Modern marriage is such a shitty deal for men in many countries that 2/3 of young men now reject marriage and paternity, and these large numbers make it the dominant cause of the crash in the birth rate. So obviously, if young men are to be persuaded to be fathers again, then governments need to make marriage and paternity non-toxic for men by fundamentally reforming the divorce laws and society along masculist lines so that divorce is not such a catastrophe for men. The Masculists want the creation of a FIP Society in which both sexes, especially girls, are socialised and educated to be FIPs so that as adults they pull their financial weight and not expect, fluffie style, to parasite off the money and labour of a man, which makes them hated, manslaving, divorce-raping vermin to Masculists, who hate such women with a passion and punish them to death by effectively exterminating them, by forcing them to rot on the shelf, manless, babyless and spat at. Thus governments need to really listen to the Masculists and implement Masculist laws. GECs, that's GECs, Gender Equality Committees, need to be set up in the parliaments that consist half of female feminist politicians and half of male masculist politicians, so that the gender issues of both sexes are dealt with equally, which is far from being the case today, which is so gynocentric when it comes to gender political law making. The male half of these GECs will then legislate the paternity rejection rate, so that men are freed from unwanted pregnancy the way women are, who have already the maternity rejection rate, aka abortion rate. Alimony needs to be thrown out. The divorce courts need to be run on the principle of financial independence of the divorcing parties, so that the divorcing father is not financially butchered the way he is today, operating under the assumption that the divorcing wife today is a fluffie, that is, an economically useless, manslaving, divorce-raping parasite, hated by the Masculists, who aim to wipe out such women by totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them. Custody of children should be given jointly so that young men do not reason that under the current system in many countries they face a 1 in 4 chance of being butchered as married fathers by a brutal gynocentric divorce court system. So governments need to masculist the divorce laws so that men are prepared to be fathers again. In other words, governments need to detoxify marriage and paternity for men. Otherwise, 2/3 and growing of young men will continue to reject marriage and paternity and thus crash the birth rate. The next biggest cause of the crash of the birth rate is women and their careerism. Thanks to men giving women science-based medicine, women now have a life expectancy of 85 years and a career window of half a century. So many women are now choosing a career over motherhood. So governments will need to go on a propaganda campaign to push both sexes to be parents by providing a series of financial and support services to strongly encourage young people to have kids. For example, hefty subsidies to parents, high quality creche facilities, for example, as in the Scandinavian countries, a substantial motherhood wage to pay women to stay at home when their kids are small, and to lessen the financial burden on the father, who without the maternity wage would then have the full burden on his shoulders of earning the living for the entire family, which is very stressful. If at first the support measures taken by governments do not succeed in bringing the birth rate back to replacement rate, then governments will need to increase their efforts and the amount of money spent on raising the birth rate. In Hungary today, which is very conscious of its low birth rate of 1.5, the Hungarian government spends about 5% of its annual GNP on raising the birth rate. Other countries may need to do similar things. Governments can use propaganda tactics by advertising the importance and moral duty, civic duty, patriotic duty to have 2.1 kids per woman. Governments can force singles in their late 20s to mid-30s to pay hefty taxes, while preaching to them that they are, quote, selfish crashers, and other slogans to ram home the message that such young people are not making a contribution to the generation of the next generation, and hence are contributing to the annihilation of the population of the country, and hence are criminals. Governments can even set up baby farms, which pay young women to be professional baby factories, churning out a baby nearly every year, which is brought up not only by the mother, but by a hefty support staff with foster fathers, also paid by the government. Whole towns can be established by governments to house these baby farming women and their professional support fathers and staff. Experience shows in today's world that single mothers raise inferior children who are more likely to suffer from teenage pregnancy, alcoholism, depression, crime, etc., than children who benefit from two-parent families. In a baby farm, the child would be raised in effect by a group of adults of both sexes whose task it is to be professional parents, paid for by the government. Governments will benefit from the fact that the Masculist movement has already been applying powerful moral pressure on women to FIP up, so women will be used to being pressured by men to do what men want. So governments can appeal to the superior logic and moral responsibility of men to pressure women to be mothers. Young women will be encouraged by men and by governments to use the Masculist CMT, that's Career Mother Timeline, which, in the case of a woman with a master's degree, goes as follows. She gets her master's degree at 23, then works for 5 years in her career competent specialty and marries during that time. She has her first kid by 29 and her second by 31. When the second kid is off to kindergarten 4 years later, she is 35 when she goes back to work. The government gives the mother a hefty maternity wage to help the father pay for the costs of the family. This way, the woman gets to keep her commitment to a lifelong, rewarding and challenging career that young women want, as well as performing her civic duty, her patriotic duty to birth and raise 2.1 kids per woman. Since the divorce courts have been masculisted, divorce is way less toxic than it was in our era for men. So men are much more willing to be fathers again, and women are prepared to be mothers again, since they know they can be both mothers and careerists, since society has been set up to facilitate just that. This is also what Masculists demand, since Masculists utterly reject being man-slaves to parasitic, fluffy females. However, due to the fact that there are too many people currently on the planet and global warming is destroying it, the above measures should be postponed a bit until the crashing birth rate has reduced the world population to about 1/10 of the current figure. Then the above measures can kick in. That would be my recommendation. So politicians will need to decide on the moment of U-turn, that is, a date in the future when the above suggestions kick in to bring the birth rate up to replacement rate. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man-Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 560 plus Masculist flyers for men's studies courses, freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.